In the summer of 1943, as Mussolini's fascist dream crumbled under the combined weight of Allied bombardment and domestic disillusion, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers found themselves adrift. Captured in Tunisia, Libya, and Sicily, they were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, not as heroes returning home, but as prisoners of war bound for an unknown land. Most expected cruelty. They had been told that Americans were barbarians, that capitalist democracy was decadent and soulless, and that defeat meant humiliation and starvation. What they found instead would shake the very foundations of their belief in fascism. The journey itself was surreal. Aboard Liberty ships, Italian POWs were given white bread, canned fruit, and even cigarettes, commodities that had long disappeared from Italian shelves. To men who had survived on meager rations of beans and dry pasta, it felt impossible. One prisoner later wrote, "When I bit into a slice of white bread, I thought it was cake." Even before reaching America, the first cracks appeared in the myth of fascist superiority. Upon arrival, the men were processed through ports like Norfolk, Virginia, and New York before being distributed to camps across the country: Texas, Mississippi, Colorado, and even as far as Utah and Wyoming. They saw vast, open landscapes, highways stretching to the horizon, and towns untouched by war. For soldiers who had watched their villages reduced to rubble, America seemed impossibly prosperous. Camp Hereford in Texas became one of the most famous Italian POW camps. Designed to hold up to 5,000 men, it was surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, but managed with a curious mixture of discipline and decency. The guards, many of them small-town Americans, treated the prisoners not as enemies, but as temporary guests of war. Every morning, the smell of real coffee drifted through the mess hall. For Italians who had not tasted true coffee in years, only a bitter barley substitute known as caffè di orzo, the experience was almost sacred. Cigarettes, too, became a symbol of an unexpected freedom. American brands like Camel, Lucky Strike, and Chesterfield circulated freely in the camp. They were part of the daily rations and could be traded for small luxuries: soap, pencils, or even a homemade radio assembled from scavenged parts. For many Italians, the cigarette was more than tobacco. It was a ritual of equality. Guards and prisoners would smoke side by side, talking about baseball, women, and the weather. In those quiet moments, the walls of ideology began to crumble. One former corporal from Naples described it years later. "In Italy, we were told that the Americans were greedy capitalists who oppressed the poor. But in the camp, an American sergeant gave me a cigarette and asked about my family. That was the moment I stopped believing everything the regime had told us." Food became another revelation. The U.S. Army, bound by the Geneva Convention, ensured that POWs received the same rations as American soldiers. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, fruit salad, and even ice cream appeared on the menu. To the astonishment of Italian officers, many of their men actually gained weight during captivity. Red Cross inspectors reported that Italian POWs at Camp Atterbury in Indiana appeared in excellent health and morale, with access to recreation, education, and abundant food. The generosity extended beyond material comfort. Many camps encouraged cultural expression. Italian prisoners organized orchestras, staged plays, and even published handwritten newspapers. The American officers, instead of forbidding these activities, supported them. They provided musical instruments, sports equipment, and books. For men who had lived under a regime that censored speech and dictated thought, it was their first encounter with the true meaning of liberty. The most symbolic of all, however, were the coffee breaks. In Italy, coffee had been rationed to near extinction. Only party officials and the wealthy could afford a few grams of the precious beans. But in America, coffee was abundant, shared without hesitation, and offered even to prisoners. The act of receiving a hot cup of coffee from an American guard became a ritual of silent transformation. It was not propaganda. It was proof that freedom could be generous, that strength could coexist with compassion. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Italian prisoners worked in agricultural units. They picked cotton, repaired fences, and helped local farmers, many of whom treated them with warmth and curiosity. On weekends, they were invited to church picnics or allowed to listen to local radio broadcasts. Southern families, whose sons were fighting in Europe, still brought the prisoners food and spoke to them through the fence. The Italians could not comprehend it. Back home, such kindness toward an enemy would have been treason. Letters sent through the Red Cross reveal how deeply these experiences affected them. One prisoner wrote to his mother, "We are prisoners, yes, but we are fed, we are respected, and no one calls us cowards. If this is the enemy, then I no longer understand what we fought for." Another wrote, "They say this is democracy. If so, it is the best weapon they have." By 1944, as Italy switched sides and joined the Allies, the US government saw an opportunity. The War Department established the Italian Service Unit's voluntary groups of former POWs who pledged to work for the Allied cause. Over 35,000 men enlisted, repairing vehicles, loading cargo, and maintaining bases across the country. They wore uniforms marked Italy and earned modest pay, but the real reward was dignity. They were no longer prisoners, they were workers contributing to victory over tyranny. The transformation was astonishing. Men who had once marched under the fascist flag now saluted the Stars and Stripes with respect. Their loyalty was not coerced. It had been earned through fair treatment, through the daily experience of equality, and through small gestures like a cigarette shared under the Texas sun. American psychologists studying POW behavior noted the phenomenon with fascination. They concluded that ideological rehabilitation was achieved not by propaganda, but by the consistent example of American democratic values expressed in daily life. The camps became informal classrooms in democracy. Many Italian officers participated in lectures and debates about literature, politics, and economics. U.S. officials provided books by Jefferson, Lincoln, and Emerson. Even the Bible, long politicized under the fascist regime, was read anew. For men who had grown up in a society dominated by censorship, these ideas were intoxicating. The camp library became more dangerous to fascism than any weapon. When the war ended and repatriation began in 1945, many of these prisoners wept as they left American soil. They returned to a devastated homeland cities in ruins, food scarce, and politics poisoned by 20 years of dictatorship. But within them burned a quiet conviction that Italy's future could only be built on freedom, tolerance, and hard work. The return to Italy was not triumphant. It was uncertain, hungry, and haunted by memory. Yet within the ruins of Naples, Rome, and Florence, the lessons learned over coffee and cigarettes in distant American camps began to take root. The men who had once been Mussolini's soldiers came home with something intangible, a new sense of dignity, and a quiet disbelief in everything fascism had ever claimed to represent. For many, the contrast was immediate. In the United States, they had lived behind barbed wire, but they had never starved. They had eaten meat, fresh bread, and fruit while their families in Italy queued for hours to receive a few ounces of black bread and watery soup. When these former POWs stepped off the ships at Naples or Taranto, they saw the faces of their countrymen, thin, tired, and hopeless, and realized that the real prison had been fascism itself. Reports from Italian officials who interviewed repatriated soldiers after 1945 paint a striking picture. Many POWs spoke not of bitterness or humiliation, but of gratitude and confusion. One officer wrote, "We were told America was a soulless land of materialists, but it was there I saw the first real example of human respect." Another wrote that his men had learned more about democracy in a Texas prison than in 20 years of fascist schooling. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, one of the largest POW facilities in the Midwest, Italian barbers had been paid to cut the hair of their guards. The American soldiers would sit in the chair and chat casually with the men they had once fought against. This simple equality had left a deep impression. One barber later told a journalist, "In Italy, you never spoke to a superior unless you were ordered to. In America, even a sergeant asked me how I was doing. That was freedom." The Red Cross, which inspected POW camps regularly, noticed how quickly Italian prisoners adapted to the rhythms of American life. They organized sports tournaments, learned English, and held Sunday Mass in makeshift chapels. Many camps built small cafes where men could drink coffee, smoke, and play cards. These were modest spaces, but within them the prisoners recreated the essence of Italian social life, only now without the shadow of the regime. The act of sharing coffee became symbolic of something larger. During the fascist years, public cafes in Italy had been places of surveillance and propaganda. Mussolini's portrait hung above every counter. Conversations were watched, and loyalty was measured by how loudly one praised the Duce. But in the American camps, coffee meant conversation without fear. Men could speak their minds, joke about the war, and even criticize their leaders. They rediscovered the pleasure of thinking freely, something no totalitarian system can survive. Cigarettes played a subtler role. In the rigid hierarchy of fascist Italy, tobacco had been a small symbol of privilege. Officers smoked imported brands, while common soldiers rolled their own with scraps of newspaper. In America, everyone smoked the same cigarettes, the same Camels and Lucky Strikes as the guards. A private could share a cigarette with a captain or with an American MP, and no one thought it strange. The cigarette in those years became the great leveler. It erased rank, nationality, and ideology. It was democracy in the form of smoke. For some prisoners, the psychological change was overwhelming. American psychologists conducting post-war studies found that Italian POWs had among the lowest rates of hostility toward their captors and the highest rates of cooperation. They called it the conversion through contact effect. The Italians had been exposed to a society where kindness was not a weakness, but a strength. The constant exposure to fair treatment slowly dismantled years of indoctrination. One striking account comes from Lieutenant Francesco Cavalli, captured in North Africa and sent to Camp Swift in Texas. In his diary, he wrote, "They fed us better than we fed our own soldiers. The guards shared their cigarettes. The chaplain gave us books to read. I began to wonder, if this is the enemy, who exactly were we fighting for?" His diary, later archived by the Italian Ministry of Defense, reveals an ideological collapse not caused by propaganda, but by comparison. The daily experience of being treated with respect by Americans, even while a prisoner, became the most devastating argument against fascism. As the war dragged on and Italy itself switched sides, these experiences turned into quiet loyalty. The Italian service units, formed in 1944, became essential to the Allied logistical effort. In ports from Boston to San Francisco, Italian volunteers repaired ships, unloaded ammunition, and maintained vehicles. They wore badges marked Italy, but carried no weapons. Their work was humble, but their pride immense. For the first time in years, they were helping to build something rather than destroy it. At Camp McCall in North Carolina, American officers noted that Italian service unit members worked with enthusiasm and discipline, often exceeding the expectations of their supervisors. One U.S. report stated, "They no longer see themselves as prisoners, but as contributors to victory." For many Italians, this experience marked their first real participation in a democratic enterprise, a system where effort was rewarded not by propaganda, but by merit. The transformation extended beyond work. American communities near the camps often interacted with the Italians. Farmers invited them to Sunday dinners. Church groups sent Christmas gifts. Children waved to them through the fences. These small gestures pierced through years of nationalist lies. One former prisoner recalled, "In fascist Italy, we were told America was ruled by Jews and gangsters. But in Mississippi, a farmer's wife gave me a piece of pie and said, 'God bless you, son.' I never forgot that." As these experiences multiplied, an entire generation of Italians underwent a collective awakening. They began to see democracy not as a political theory, but as a lived experience, one that offered dignity even to the defeated. When they eventually returned home, they carried these lessons like seeds in their pockets. In 1946, as Italy held its first free elections in more than 2 decades, the influence of returning POWs became clear. Many voted for democratic and moderate parties, rejecting the totalitarian ideologies that had led them to ruin. Historians have noted that regions with high concentrations of former POWs showed stronger support for pro-Western movements in the post-war years. The American camps, as they were called, had quietly become schools of freedom. In interviews conducted decades later, former prisoners spoke not of shame, but of gratitude. Some described their time in captivity as the best years of their lives. It wasn't that they enjoyed imprisonment. It was that, for the first time, they experienced fairness. They were listened to, fed, and treated as human beings. One man said, "I went to America a fascist and came back an Italian." The Red Cross archives confirmed that Italian POWs were among the healthiest and most contented of all prisoners held by the United States. Photographs show them smiling, playing soccer, or performing music in open-air theaters. There was still barbed wire, but the atmosphere was human. The U.S. government, aware of this psychological success, began to study the phenomenon. Military analysts concluded that material abundance, coffee, cigarettes, food, was not the true cause of conversion. It was the combination of abundance with equality. The prisoners saw a society that was wealthy yet generous, powerful yet compassionate. This contradicted every tenet of fascist ideology, which equated strength with domination. In the end, the collapse of fascism in the hearts of these men came not through defeat in battle, but through the shock of kindness. A cup of coffee shared without condescension, a cigarette passed through the fence, a meal eaten in dignity. These simple moments carried a moral weight greater than any speech or bomb. The legacy of that transformation would ripple across decades. In the years that followed, many former POWs became teachers, engineers, or small business owners. Some even emigrated back to the United States, seeking the land that had shown them the meaning of freedom. Others helped shape Italy's post-war constitution, infusing it with the ideals they had glimpsed during captivity: equality before the law, respect for labor, and the belief that liberty must be shared, not imposed. By the 1950s, American sociologists visiting Italy noted a curious phenomenon. In towns where many former POWs had returned, anti-American sentiment was almost non-existent. They were known as gli Americani, the Americans, not because they had changed nationality, but because they had changed in spirit. The story of these men, however, was almost forgotten. For decades, Italy preferred not to remember the years of captivity, seeing them as a symbol of defeat. Yet hidden in diaries, letters, and Red Cross reports lies one of the most extraordinary tales of moral transformation in modern history. A story not about conquest, but about the quiet power of compassion. In post-war Italy, memories of defeat were painful. Veterans rarely spoke of the war, and those who had been captured often faced suspicion. Some Italians viewed prisoners as cowards who had surrendered too easily. Others, still clinging to fascist pride, considered their exposure to America a contamination. But beneath this silence, something profound had taken place. These former POWs carried within them a new definition of honor, one that no longer depended on obedience or violence, but on mutual respect. In many cases, their testimonies were preserved by chance. Diaries smuggled out of camps, letters kept by families, or notes later donated to local archives paint a vivid portrait of daily life behind barbed wire. They reveal a world where men who had once shouted "Viva il Duce" now debated the virtues of democracy and dreamed of a different Italy. One diary found in the archives of Camp Hereford describes how prisoners would gather each morning around a coffee pot salvaged from an American kitchen. The aroma filled the barracks, mixing with laughter and conversation. The diarist wrote, "We drink coffee like free men. We sit, we speak, we disagree, and no one listens to denounce us. It feels like being reborn." Another prisoner, a teacher before the war, wrote from Camp Shelby, "We have discovered that freedom is not given by slogans, but by small things. A cigarette offered, a question asked, a smile without suspicion. These are the foundations of a new Italy." Historians studying these writings now see them as a bridge between two eras, the fascist past and the democratic rebirth that followed. The prisoners' experience was, in effect, a social experiment. Thousands of men exposed to a different civilization during one of the darkest times in human history. The Red Cross regularly reported on the humane conditions of Italian POW camps, often contrasting them with those under the Axis powers. The organization's inspectors noted that Italian prisoners were allowed to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, attend religious services, and receive visits from Italian-American priests. They could even request educational materials from universities. Such privileges shocked them. In fascist Italy, even citizens had been denied free access to foreign books or ideas. In time, these men began to change not only their minds, but their daily behavior. They formed small councils to manage internal affairs, practiced democratic voting to resolve disputes, and learned to run their own micro-society within the camp. American officers encouraged this, seeing it as both practical and educational. The result was that thousands of Italians gained first-hand experience in self-governance long before Italy itself returned to democracy. At Camp Atterbury, a group of educated prisoners established a University of Freedom, an informal school where former teachers, engineers, and artists gave lectures on philosophy, literature, and history. The camp commander approved it, even providing materials. Within months, hundreds of men attended nightly classes by lamplight, discussing Plato, Dante, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. What began as a way to pass time became a spiritual rebellion against dictatorship. The role of American chaplains was equally influential. Catholic priests working in the camps encouraged moral reflection rather than nationalism. They preached forgiveness, human dignity, and peace, messages that resonated deeply with men raised under fascist propaganda. The prisoners began to reinterpret faith itself, separating religion from politics for the first time in their lives. Even work became a form of transformation. In Italian service units, POWs learned the ethics of labor in a democratic system, one based not on fear, but on cooperation. They worked alongside Americans, received wages, and could spend them at canteens, or save them for their families. The feeling of being trusted, even slightly, was revolutionary. In some camps, American guards noticed that the Italians began to organize themselves into work teams without supervision. They competed not to avoid punishment, but to earn respect. For men who had lived in a society ruled by coercion, this was a revelation. As one American officer wrote, "The Italians worked harder when we treated them as equals. They had been taught to obey, but they learned to volunteer." This spirit of voluntary effort mirrored a larger awakening, a realization that true freedom was not the absence of rules, but the presence of dignity. The Italian soldiers began to see democracy not as chaos, but as shared responsibility. Not all encounters were idealized, of course. There were tensions, cultural misunderstandings, and occasional outbursts. Some guards treated prisoners harshly. Some prisoners clung to fascist pride. But even these conflicts revealed something new. The disagreement could exist without violence. The Americans punished infractions through fair trials within the camp, allowing prisoners to defend themselves. For men accustomed to summary discipline, this was stunning. The concept of justice itself began to change in their minds. As months turned into years, many Italian POWs began to write to their families with a new tone. Their letters were no longer desperate or fearful, but filled with reflection and hope. One wrote to his wife, "In this faraway place, I have learned that freedom is not only a dream. It is a way of treating others." When these men returned home, they brought stories that seemed unbelievable to those who had suffered under the war. They told of American guards who shared cigarettes, of coffee served hot every morning, of food so abundant it seemed endless. But beyond the material comforts, they spoke of equality, of a land where even prisoners were called Sir. For many Italians still living amid ruins, such tales sounded like fantasy. Yet they carried an undeniable moral weight. The ex-prisoners had seen the alternative to dictatorship, not in speeches, but in action. Their experiences became living proof that another world was possible. Sociologists later found that these returning POWs often became informal community leaders. In villages across southern and central Italy, they organized cooperatives, promoted education, and discouraged revenge. They had learned in captivity that human decency could rebuild what ideology had destroyed. Even the simple habits they brought home symbolized change. They taught their families how to brew coffee the American way, with cream and sugar. They rolled their cigarettes differently, spoke with new words. Okay, coffee break. Camp. These linguistic traces, small and almost invisible, were fragments of a cultural exchange that outlasted the war itself. The influence also reached Italian culture. In the 1950s, Italian neorealist filmmakers such as De Sica and Rossellini began depicting ordinary people rediscovering humanity amid ruin, stories deeply aligned with the moral journey of the POWs. Some historians argue that the optimism and humility of post-war Italian cinema owed much to those who had glimpsed America's resilience firsthand. Behind every film, every rebuilt street, and every new Constitution article was the memory of that first cup of American coffee, served in a dusty camp somewhere in Texas or Mississippi. It was a small act, easily overlooked, yet in its warmth lay a quiet revolution. In the long arc of history, wars are often remembered for battles, generals, and treaties. But the story of the Italian POWs in America reminds us that civilizations are ultimately judged by how they treat the defeated. The United States, in those years, did something remarkable. It conquered not by force, but by example. The American experiment in humane captivity did not only win hearts, it reshaped a nation's future. By turning enemies into admirers, the U.S. demonstrated that freedom, once witnessed, cannot be forgotten. As post-war reconstruction began, Italy faced hunger, political chaos, and deep moral exhaustion. Yet in the midst of despair, the returning prisoners carried a spark of faith in humanity, a belief that the simple virtues they had learned in captivity could rebuild their broken homeland. In 1945, Italian cities were ruins of brick and ash. The fascist regime had fallen, Mussolini was dead, and the monarchy teetered on collapse. Across the country, resentment brewed between former fascists, partisans, and Allied supporters. People were desperate and divided. Into this confusion came men who had spent the war not in partisan mountains or prison basements, but behind American fences. Men who, paradoxically, had experienced more stability in captivity than many civilians had in freedom. They returned quietly, without parades or honors. But their attitude was different. Where others were consumed by bitterness, they carried calmness. They had lived among people who believed in rules, decency, and generosity, and they brought that mindset home with them. Some joined the labor unions that would rebuild the Italian economy. Others entered politics, local councils, or schools. And in each of these places, they spread an idea that had once seemed foreign, that dignity belonged to every man, even the defeated. Reports from Italian provincial offices in 1946 describe a curious phenomenon. Former POWs were often called upon to mediate disputes between rival political groups. They had learned patience and communication from dealing with Americans, and now applied those skills at home. One mayor from Apulia wrote, "The men returned from the camps of America speak differently. They no longer shout or threaten. They listen. They have learned democracy not from books, but from example." The influence was subtle, but far-reaching. During the critical 1946 referendum that abolished the monarchy and created the Italian Republic, many of these ex-POWs became active advocates for peaceful transition. Their exposure to American elections, the sight of people voting without fear, had left a deep impression. For them, ballots replaced bullets. They knew from experience that authority could be respected without worship, and that laws could exist to protect rather than to punish. In small villages from Calabria to Lombardy, they introduced practices learned in the camps: shared decision-making, equal pay for work, fair distribution of rations. These might seem trivial, but in a nation traumatized by 20 years of dictatorship, they were acts of rebirth. The democratic habits formed in the camps became seeds planted in the soil of post-war Italy. Culturally, they became bridges between two worlds. They wrote articles for local newspapers describing American life, the cars, the vast farms, the public libraries, and the ordinary friendliness of citizens. In towns where propaganda had once portrayed America as a decadent empire, these stories shattered stereotypes. One ex-POW wrote in 1947, "I saw a guard give his lunch to a prisoner because the man looked tired. No dictator can create such a gesture by law." Their experiences also changed how they viewed work itself. Under fascism, labor had been glorified as service to the state. In America, they saw work as a path to personal freedom. That distinction became central to Italy's reconstruction. Many who had served in Italian service units later became skilled workers in factories rebuilding the nation's industry. Others brought with them the American attitude toward initiative and efficiency. At Camp Swift and Camp Hereford, some had learned carpentry, mechanics, or farming techniques from American instructors. They applied those skills in post-war cooperatives, teaching others what they had learned in captivity. These small efforts collectively helped transform Italy from a devastated agricultural country into a modern industrial power. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For a generation raised to obey, the war and its aftermath had destroyed trust. Trust in leaders, in institutions, even in God. The ex-POWs, however, had rediscovered trust in the most unlikely place, the enemy's camp. They had learned that order could coexist with mercy, that strength did not require cruelty. They became living refutations of the fascist belief that only fear could unite a nation. One of them, Pietro Massoni, who later became a schoolteacher in Emilia-Romagna, wrote, "In the camps we were prisoners, yet we were freer than we had ever been in Italy. We learned that obedience without respect is slavery. The Americans showed us how to work without fear. That lesson I have taught to every child since." Their influence was also felt in Italy's new constitution, drafted in 1946-47. Among the advisors and public commentators who helped shape its democratic principles were several former POWs. They argued passionately for clauses guaranteeing human rights, personal freedom, and labor protections. Ideals they had seen practiced, however imperfectly, in American life. The preamble of the Italian Constitution, which speaks of the inviolable rights of man, both as an individual and in the social groups where his personality is expressed, echoes the language heard daily in those faraway camps. Respect, equality, dignity. By the early 1950s, the memory of captivity had softened into nostalgia. Newspapers began publishing memoirs of the Americans' prisoners, often filled with affection and disbelief. One popular serial recounted how Italian cooks in a Texas camp had learned to make apple pie and chili con carne. Another told of a guard who mailed a prisoner's guitar back to Italy after the war. These small stories, printed in post-war magazines, reached millions and quietly reshaped public perception of America. Meanwhile, in the United States, former camp guards and local civilians also remembered the Italians with warmth. Some had formed lasting friendships, exchanging letters long after the war. American families who had employed POWs on their farms often spoke of them as good boys who worked hard and smiled often. A few even sponsored their immigration years later. It was a story of mutual humanization, enemies discovering their common humanity through daily contact. The barbed wire that had once divided them became a symbol not of hatred, but of shared endurance. In the archives of Camp Hereford, a remarkable document survives, a Christmas program from 1944, printed in both English and Italian. It lists carols sung jointly by prisoners and American guards. Silent Night, O Holy Night, Adeste Fideles. At the bottom, in simple handwriting, someone added, Peace on earth begins here. That sentiment captures the essence of what happened in those years. The camps were not paradise, and captivity was still hardship. Yet within their fences, a moral miracle took place, one that revealed how the smallest gestures of decency could disarm ideology more effectively than any army. The coffee and cigarettes that gave this story its name were never luxuries to the Italians. They were symbols of something much greater: the right to be treated as men, not machines of the state. Each cup of coffee was a quiet lesson in equality. Each cigarette shared between guard and prisoner was an unspoken declaration that the war's divisions could not erase human fellowship. In a world still haunted by propaganda and hatred, these moments of ordinary kindness became acts of resistance against tyranny itself. When asked years later what had changed him the most, one former soldier from Sicily simply said, "The taste of American coffee. It was bitter and sweet, and I thought, if they can give this to their enemy, they must be free men." That realization, humble, sensory, and profoundly human, became the beginning of Italy's spiritual reconstruction. Before the Marshall Plan rebuilt bridges and factories, coffee and cigarettes had already rebuilt something far more important: the Italian soul. The idea that freedom could be learned through the senses, through taste, smell, and touch, may sound poetic, but for these men, it was real. They had touched the material symbols of liberty: clean clothes, warm food, a friendly gesture. These things reached deeper than ideology ever could. They proved that democracy was not an abstract system, but a way of living together. In this way, the American camps became laboratories of humanity. They showed that compassion is contagious, that kindness can spread even through wire fences, and that the most effective antidote to totalitarianism is simple decency practiced daily. By the mid-1950s, the Italian POWs' experience had begun to influence art, politics, and memory itself. What began as personal gratitude slowly evolved into cultural admiration, helping to shape the enduring alliance between Italy and the United States. In films, novels, and songs, echoes of that experience could be heard. The first post-war generation of Italian artists was fascinated by the contrast between the cruelty of fascism and the humanity found in unexpected places. Directors like Vittorio De Sica and Roberto Rossellini, who had both witnessed the collapse of the old world, created stories filled with compassion for ordinary people. Their characters, workers, mothers, and soldiers searched for dignity amid ruins. Though few of these artists were prisoners themselves, the emotional tone of their work mirrored the mindset of those who had lived through captivity in America: humility, empathy, and hope. Cultural historians have noted that the neo-realist movement, which became Italy's most influential artistic export after the war, shared a key moral principle with the POW experience: the belief that truth and humanity emerge from the simplest acts of kindness. The same moral awakening that began in the camps resonated on screen. In this sense, the transformation of the Italian POWs was not only political, it became part of the nation's emotional DNA. Meanwhile, the men themselves aged into fathers, teachers, and small-town leaders. They rarely called themselves heroes, but their families noticed their difference. Their children grew up hearing about the American years, not as a story of defeat, but as a story of awakening. Some kept the camp photographs, showing smiling young Italians in U.S. uniforms marked Italy. Others treasured postcards sent from Texas, with images of vast open skies and farms that looked nothing like the narrow streets of home. Many of these men became informal ambassadors of American culture in post-war Italy. They introduced habits that soon became part of everyday life: drinking coffee at breakfast, chewing gum, listening to jazz, greeting neighbors with an easy hello. To them, these small customs were symbols of freedom tokens of a world where class and hierarchy mattered less than decency. Economically, Italy's post-war recovery accelerated through the Marshall Plan, but the psychological groundwork for cooperation had already been laid by those who had known America firsthand. When U.S. aid arrived, there was little resistance among the people. The former POWs explained that it was not humiliation to accept help from the same country that had once guarded them. It was partnership. They trusted the motives of the Americans because they had seen their character up close. In 1953, the Italian journalist Enrico Serra interviewed several ex-prisoners for a series titled Gli Americani ci hanno insegnato la libertà. The Americans taught us freedom. The men spoke plainly, without romanticism. One said, "I never read Lincoln before the war. I read him in an American camp. He wrote that all men are created equal. I believed it when I saw it." Another added, "We learned democracy from coffee, not from speeches. You drank it with everyone, and everyone was equal." These testimonies spread widely, shaping Italian attitudes during the Cold War. When Italy joined NATO in 1949, many of these former POWs quietly supported the move. They saw alignment with the West, not as political submission, but as an affirmation of the human values they had experienced firsthand. For them, democracy was no longer foreign. It was familiar, even intimate. In rural villages, some even opened cafes they called America or Camp Texas, decorated with flags and photos from their captivity. These were not acts of nostalgia, but of gratitude. The coffee they served symbolized the warmth they had once received as prisoners. It was as if they were passing on the same kindness that had freed their minds. One remarkable example came from a man named Giovanni Piras, who had been imprisoned in Mississippi. Returning to Sardinia, he opened a small cafe in 1948 and named it Café della Libertà, the Cafe of Freedom. He decorated the walls with faded clippings of American trucks, jazz bands, and Coca-Cola signs. To the locals, it became a place not just to drink, but to talk freely about politics, religion, and the future. Pyrrhus often told his customers, "We learned that freedom is a conversation, not a command." The story repeated across Italy. In Naples, Rome, and Turin, American bars became gathering spots for young Italians fascinated by the style and optimism of the United States. Few knew that these places had roots in POW camps, that their founders had first learned the rituals of coffee, cigarettes, and civility under American watchtowers. The United States, too, recognized the importance of these experiences. In 1955, an American veterans magazine published an article titled "The Italians Who Went Home Loving Us." It described how former prisoners wrote letters thanking their captors, sending gifts, and even inviting them to visit Italy. Some guards accepted. There are recorded reunions between former POWs and American officers in the 1960s, meetings filled with laughter, hugs, and disbelief that war had ever stood between them. In a world divided by the Cold War, these personal connections mattered. Italy, once a fascist dictatorship, had become one of America's most reliable allies in Europe. Behind this diplomatic bond lay thousands of invisible friendships forged over coffee cups in the camps of Texas and Mississippi. Yet memory is fragile. As decades passed, the story risked fading away. Historians focused on grander narratives battles, politics, treaties, while the quiet revolution of the POWs remained largely in private letters and local archives. Only recently have researchers begun to reconstruct the full picture, piecing together how an entire generation of soldiers experienced moral transformation through everyday humanity. Documents from the U.S. Army, preserved at the National Archives, describe how Italian prisoners were classified as cooperative and industrious. Red Cross reports note that their morale remains remarkably high, and that political hostility diminishes steadily. In other words, the transformation was observed in real time. The American system of humane captivity was not an accident. It was a conscious decision based on belief in human decency as a strategic weapon. American officers wrote that kindness and fairness were more effective than punishment. They knew that every meal served, every cigarette shared, was part of a larger campaign, a moral one. By treating the Italians as men rather than enemies, they undermined fascism more completely than any propaganda leaflet could have done. From a strategic standpoint, this approach paid immense dividends. By 1944, the Italian service units had become a vital auxiliary force for the Allies. They unloaded munitions, repaired tanks, and constructed barracks across the U.S. mainland and overseas bases. Their reliability freed thousands of American soldiers for combat duty. The very men who had once fought under Mussolini were now helping defeat Nazi Germany. But beyond the military value, the psychological transformation of these men was priceless. It showed that freedom could convert hearts not through fear, but through example. When they returned home, Some Italians faced skepticism. "You have been Americanized," neighbors told them. "You forgot Italy." Yet within a few years, those same neighbors began to imitate their ways, working cooperatively, speaking politely, organizing community events, even brewing stronger coffee. The habits of democracy, once learned, proved contagious. In a 1958 interview, a former Italian prisoner summarized it best. "They gave us cigarettes. They gave us coffee. But what they really gave us was time. Time to think about who we wanted to be when the war was over." His words capture the essence of the entire story. The camps were not classrooms in the formal sense. There were no slogans, no ideological lectures. There was only the slow, daily rhythm of fairness, meals served without discrimination, rules applied equally, humor shared across languages. Out of this ordinary decency grew a quiet revolution of the mind. Today, few remember that over 50,000 Italian soldiers spent the war years in the United States. Yet the legacy of their captivity continues to shape the bond between the two nations. It reminds us that victory is not only measured by battles won, but by souls redeemed. For those men, freedom did not arrive on the day they were released. It had already begun years earlier. In the first sip of real coffee, in the first cigarette lit by a former enemy, and in the moment they realized that humanity could survive even in war. Decades later, as the last surviving Italian POWs told their stories, historians began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. What started as an accident of war had become a profound lesson for civilization itself, that empathy can achieve what violence never can. By the 1980s and 1990s, researchers from both Italy and the United States began recording oral histories from surviving prisoners. Old men with trembling hands described the taste of American coffee, the smell of cigarettes under the Texas sun, and the laughter they shared with guards who had once been their enemies. Many spoke with tears, not of suffering, but of gratitude. One of them, Antonio Rossi, captured in Tunisia and sent to Camp Shelby, recalled, "When I first arrived, I thought they would beat us. Instead, they gave us bread and coffee. I thought it was a trick. But after a week, after a month, it never changed. That is when I realized that goodness can be stronger than hate." Another, Enzo Ciarli from Florence, remembered how a guard named Jim taught him to play the harmonica. He said music was freedom. "I didn't understand at first, but I played every night. When I came home, I played it in the ruins of my city. People stopped to listen. That was how I knew we were alive again." Such stories, once dismissed as sentimental, are now seen as crucial evidence of a deeper historical truth. The humane treatment of the Italian POWs represented not just generosity, but a moral experiment that changed both captors and captives. For the Americans, it affirmed faith in their own democratic ideals, that even in war, human dignity could be preserved. For the Italians, it was a revelation that destroyed the foundation of totalitarian belief. Military historians analyzing the POW program later concluded that its success was rooted in cultural respect. The Americans understood that Italy's soldiers had not all been ideologues. Many were simply men swept up in history's tide. By treating them as individuals, rather than as symbols of fascism, the U.S. Army allowed them to rediscover their humanity. The transformation of these prisoners became a living metaphor for Italy's own national rebirth. Just as they had been freed not by force, but by kindness, so too would Italy be rebuilt not through vengeance, but through cooperation. The democratic miracle that followed, the creation of a stable republic in a country once ruled by dictatorship, owed something to those lessons learned across the ocean. In recent years, Italian historians have traced the spread of former POW communities across the country. They found that towns with high concentrations of returnees often experienced faster post-war recovery, higher literacy, and lower political extremism. These were the same towns where coffee bars, cooperatives, and civic associations flourished. Small institutions inspired, consciously or not, by the camp societies of America. In 2010, At a ceremony in Hereford, Texas, local residents and Italian descendants gathered to unveil a memorial to the Italian prisoners who had lived there. The monument, a simple stone engraved in both languages, reads, "From enemies to friends, from prisoners to free men, we remember." Among the guests was the son of an Italian barber who had once cut soldiers' hair in the camp. He spoke softly, saying, "My father used to say that he learned how to live like a man here, not in the army, not under Mussolini, but here, where he was a prisoner." The story has continued to inspire new generations. Students in Italian schools now study the POW experiences as part of understanding the post-war democratic transformation. Museums in Texas, Georgia, and California display photographs of smiling Italian prisoners tending gardens, performing music, and learning English. Each image carries the same quiet message, that humanity can survive even in captivity. There is an irony in this tale that history cannot ignore. Mussolini had promised to forge a new man, disciplined, loyal, fearless. Instead, that new man was created in America through the paradox of defeat. The Italian prisoners who returned home were indeed new men, but not the kind the regime had envisioned. They were humble, tolerant, and open-minded, shaped not by ideology, but by kindness. Even in the language of those years, we find traces of the transformation. In post-war letters and memoirs, the word libertà, freedom, appears again and again, but often not in the political sense. It meant personal dignity, fairness, the ability to speak one's mind. These men had experienced freedom not as a theory, but as hospitality served in a tin cup. In 1994, at a veterans' reunion in Naples, an elderly former POW named Luigi Benedetti told a reporter, "We were conquered by coffee. You can laugh, but it's true. We drank it, and we realized that we had been lied to. They told us the Americans were monsters, but they were men like us, just freer." His laughter turned to silence as he added, "That's when fascism died for me." The phrase "conquered by coffee" spread through Italian media, capturing the poetic heart of what had happened. Historians began to use it as shorthand for the quiet psychological revolution that took place among Italian soldiers in captivity. The taste of coffee, the smell of tobacco, the feeling of being treated decently. These became metaphors for liberation. Even decades later, surviving prisoners often described the camps in sensory terms. They spoke of the brightness of American mornings, the texture of white bread, the clean uniforms, and the laughter of guards. For men who had lived through the dust and chaos of the African front, these sensations were overwhelming. They remembered America not as a place of victory or defeat, but as a place of awakening. Today, when historians speak of the collapse of fascism, they often point to military defeats, El Alamein, Sicily, or the fall of Rome. But there was another collapse, quieter and more profound, the collapse of belief. It happened not on the battlefield, but in the mess halls of Texas, where Italian soldiers sipped coffee and realized that their enemy civilization was built on something stronger than fear. It was in those moments that fascism truly died, not under bombs, but under kindness. The legacy of this moral awakening can still be felt in the enduring friendship between Italy and the United States. The two nations, once enemies, became allies bound not only by treaties, but by shared values of democracy and compassion. The memory of those camps, and of the men who passed through them, remains a testament to the human capacity for change. At its core, this story reminds us that the most powerful weapons are not made of steel or fire. They are made of generosity, patience, and understanding. When an American guard handed an Italian prisoner a cigarette, he did more than offer comfort. He offered proof that freedom could be merciful. Every gesture, every shared meal, every kind word chipped away at the walls of totalitarian thought until only humanity remained. The historian Luigi Monteleone once wrote, "The Americans defeated fascism twice, once with their armies and once with their decency." It is hard to find a truer summary of the Italian POW experience. When the last of these men passed away, they left behind more than memories. They left behind a living example that liberty is not taught by force, but felt through kindness, that the smallest acts can change nations, and that sometimes history's greatest revolutions begin not with a gunshot, but with a cup of coffee. And so the story ends where it began, in the quiet steam rising from a tin mug, somewhere in a prison camp half a world away. A young Italian soldier, defeated but alive, takes a sip, tastes something he cannot name, and in that simple, ordinary moment discovers the flavor of freedom.